let's talk about rituals. Hello guys and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode we are talking about ritual summoning and ritual monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! And more specifically, why they are the weakest of the summoning mechanics, by far. I don't think anyone would try and make the argument otherwise for something else, like maybe Pendulum or something along those lines. But in all honesty, rituals are pretty bad. And the main reason for this is kind of threefold. One, they require specific cards. Most ritual spells require, ritual monsters require specific spells tied to them to actually be able to ritual a summon. Like for example with the novels, they require their recipes, which honestly isn't too big of a deal seeing as how basically all of the recipes can at least summon any of the monsters for the most part, right? The fish recipe can, or the meat recipe can summon either of or any of the novels, so that's fairly decent, and they can search it out. Again, fairly decent. But the fact of the matter is, they do need that spell just to hit the field, right? The second thing is the simple fact that they also require a cost. Not just that ritual spell, but now you also need something to tribute, right? So, again, in the case of novels, sure, you search out the spell, now you need another monster just to summon the monster you already had in hand, and that's the third one, being that monster in hand or elsewhere. Sometimes you can summon from grave, like with Vendrids or what have you. Now, with all of this in mind, rituals don't seem all that strong, just inherently by the way that they were designed. And I honestly think that in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, when rituals were basically the only way to ritual summon, if we go back to Novell and things like Hungry Burger, we can see that basically the whole idea was, hey, this is a guy that you can special summon, meaning you can summon it on your turn after utilizing your normal summon, or even just on top of utilizing your normal summon. In fact, you could special summon this and then tribute over it with something like a Monarch if you wanted to. But even in the past, they didn't really work well, because you still had to find those specific pieces, and it's not like you could search out Hungry Burger, you could search out the recipe, or anything like that. It was all just pray that you got it. And rituals have been flawed ever since. Now, with the introduction of more and more ritual archetypes, saying that they are still flawed is not entirely accurate. I mean, for example, Necroz, which I don't have on here. Looking at Necroz, we have things like Bryonic, Shurit, and even Clausulus to search out and replenish the resources that they would have utilized for the ritual summon. And with the ritual spells being Kaleidoscope, Cycle, and Mirror, all allowing you to utilize different resources from various areas, like the extra deck, in order to ritual summon, that allows rituals to basically bypass their biggest mechanic. And it's only when they are able to do said thing that they ever see any relevance. There's only really been two meta decks that are rituals, and that being Necroz and Drytron. And what does Drytron do? Except for skip the ritual cost. By utilizing the attack instead of the levels, this means that you can play level 1 monsters with high attack stats instead of actually utilizing the levels like most other decks would do. This means you can get out really large monsters without really having to pay for a big cost. And with things like Medionis Drytron constantly putting itself back into the hand and not having a once per turn, it means you can ritual summon a bunch. However, even with that being said, Drytrons don't do that. They ritual summon maybe twice per turn, which is fairly decent, but they're not really focused on ritual summoning. Their goal is to basically spit out a whole bunch of these Drytron monsters, and then end on boss monsters like Herald of Ultimateness, or even their own boss monsters, right? And I think that's where rituals realistically kind of shine. I think some of the boss monsters that rituals have are fairly decent. The biggest issue is that they are main deck monsters, and unlike things from the extra deck, you can't really utilize those main deck monsters effectively. You still have to search them from the deck. You can't just summon them willy-nilly. You still have the process of actually adding it to your hand, then ritual summoning it, and all of that jazz, which can be stopped pretty frequently and pretty easily nowadays. So it's not exactly the easiest thing to do. And while I do think that that balances out things like Herald of Ultimateness, that's kind of the only real boss monster that there is that actually does much. Most of the other ritual boss monsters are kind of going second options. Again, thinking of like Draconids or what have you, sure, you could summon something like a Blue Eyes Ultimate, Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon on the first turn and hope that it survives without its, or with its protections of not being targeted, not being able to be destroyed, and 4,000 attack, but as soon as they activate anything that switches it to defense or just makes access code talker and just walks over it in battle, yeah, you're not really going to be able to do much. And sure, it's very good at OTKing, but again, that's not really that great. And because of this, rituals, again, even with the introduction of things like Herald of Ultimateness and stuff, they haven't really succeeded all that often, right? Now, you could argue that, like, oh, Makonko technically is a ritual deck. Alright, let's talk about Makonko. Makonko is another deck that, sure, can work in theory if you think about it being a ritual deck, but in reality, it's not really a ritual deck. It has a ritual monster that you never really ritual summon. In fact, you just cheat it out utilizing Ceremony. And again, that kind of is my point. Sure, there are ritual decks that kind of function. Megalith is a deck that is a ritual deck, but it also bypasses that ritual mechanic, right? And again, that is mostly because of the way that resources work in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, oftentimes people think of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a resourceless card game, but that is far from the truth. The resources are cards in hand, cards in the extra deck, and what have you. Cards even in deck count as resources. And that is mostly what resources are utilized as in Yu-Gi-Oh! And with rituals, you have to utilize 3 of those resources immediately. And with a starting hand of 5, utilizing 3 cards just to summon 1 monster often causes issues. Now, this wouldn't be that big of a deal if rituals got something like a Link to that they could potentially utilize to cheat out monsters or potentially help them with ritual summons. And while you could argue that Cross Sheep does fill that void, it's not nearly as close as something like Halqifibrax, Electromite, or even Verte, right? And sure, Bujinki the Bujinki Exi Link monster isn't exactly great, but it, at the very least, allows you to get 2 Exi material and then Exi summon. So, something like that for rituals would at least be helpful. Though Cross Sheep's not terrible. Drawing 2 and then discarding 2 is, in theory, pretty good. But, again, that's not really replenishing any resources. If it drew 2 and then discarded 1, maybe you could see it as worthwhile, and maybe that would be the point of Cross Sheep, but it's not. It has a much better fusion effect. So, And sure, you could argue, like, oh, Herald of Arclight can be sent from the grave with things like Diviner, so there's still stuff there. But, honestly, rituals, let's be honest, not very good. And I think, at this point, we all realize this. However, that doesn't mean that there's no hope for them. And in fact, I think that there are a few simple changes that could actually make rituals pretty useful. Or, at the very least, able to compete. Similar to things like Pendulum are right now, but even better. And there are a few changes that I think are not at all going to happen, but would be interesting. And then there's one change in particular that I think is the correct way to go moving forward. Let's talk about the 3 things that could potentially happen with rituals. First and foremost, just take away one of the costs. Whether that be needing a ritual spell or needing the levels, more likely the levels, necessary to actually ritual summon, and instead you just go activate the spell and then summon the monster, similar to fusion summoning, right? Except, I guess not really fusion summoning, but more so like, I don't know, like E-Telly or something along those lines, right? Now, sure, that could work, but that, again, kind of gets rid of the main mechanic of rituals and really changes a lot of the decks and the way that they function, right? Especially things like Ben 10. Not tributing Ben 10 would entirely kill the card. It wouldn't have any effect, basically. So, not likely, but something that could happen and would make rituals pretty decent. The second thing, which is a lot less likely, even more so than the previous one, putting them into the extra deck. Now, this is something that originally should have just happened. They seemed like extra deck monsters, they seemed to go there similar to fusion monsters, and then they never were, and they were main deck monsters. But honestly, had they just been originally extra deck monsters, I think obviously it would have been a lot more sensical, and you could have done a lot more for it. Sure, having a 2-card combo is still steep in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, but even that is fairly decent to get out something like Herald of Ultimateness, right? Now, I don't think those two are likely to happen, but there is a third option that I do genuinely believe would change rituals for the better, and would most likely allow them to play Yu-Gi-Oh! On the same tier as basically every other mechanic. And that is simply making better archetypes. Now, that sounds really strange, but I do have an actual idea for this. So, similar to how megaliths currently work, where they utilize the monsters to go into the monsters by utilizing basically Phaleg or Full or something like that as ritual spells, you could basically do the same thing with future archetypes, foregoing the cost, foregoing the actual mechanics, and just treating them as ritual summons. Now, this does, again, kind of take away from the actual ritual feel, but it is kind of the way that rituals would work, and it's happened twice now already. Now, I'm not a big fan of Drytron, and I think that realistically is having a deck that is similar in nature to Drytron, but instead is actually ritual monsters, would be very interesting, and would at least allow for rituals to still exist and to still work. But I don't know. I feel like rituals are in such a bad state, there's not really a way to make them playable without entirely foregoing one of the costs, right? One of the major things that makes rituals rituals. And by losing that, it really does hinder the summoning mechanic, and hinder Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole by just basically removing one. So, those are my thoughts. I have really been thinking about rituals for a while. I thoroughly enjoy them. I think that they're very fun, and I really want to see them do well again. But alas, here we are. Anyway, that's going to be it for this episode. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy. If you did, I like this very much so appreciated it, and if you want to check out more content like this, as well as more Yu-Gi-Oh!, then just be sure to subscribe. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.